if you don't mind.
Okay, so my name is Brooke Hines, and I have been doing some form of bat-related work since 1996. I got my start doing an internship with Student Conservation Association. So if anyone's an undergrad and trying to figure out what they want to do, I strongly recommend them. I'm sure there are lots of others, but back in the mid-90s, that was kind of the go-to place. And during my internship, I got to net silver-haired bats in South Dakota with a grad student. And after that, I was hooked on bats. And I also volunteered during the time when I was in college at a wildlife rehab center. And I had delusions that I was going to be a vet. So I worked at vet clinics, and that all helped to get my rabies vaccine. So if you are wanting to work with bats and you don't have your rabies vaccine, go work at a vet clinic, go volunteer at a wildlife rehab place. Sometimes they'll help out, if not pay for your rabies vaccine. Get your titer checked at least every other year, if not yearly, to make sure that you still are somewhat carrying some antibodies for it. It doesn't fully protect you from it, but from my understanding, it gives you some immunity before symptoms set in, and so you've got a little bit of time. I did my internship, got hooked on bats, and I was in undergrad, and I was majoring in zoology, and I quickly changed my major to wildlife management. At Rutgers, it may be wildlife biology or something like that. Graduated with my degree and thought, then what? So then I did another internship because there weren't a lot of paying jobs for recently graduated wildlife biology majors. And so after a few internships, another with the SCA, a great one with the Wildlife Society. I did an internship with them in policy, and that really helped me get a better understanding of how policy really drives a lot of what we do in private sector and public sector as well. And so from there, I really tried to get on with state Fish and Wildlife, federal Fish and Wildlife. I don't know if any of you have started any of those application processes, but don't get discouraged if you don't get any replies to your first 1, 10, or even 100 applications, because it is just a daunting task, and there's a lot of people applying. So because I couldn't do that, I decided to check out, what is this thing called consulting? I'd never heard of it before. And back then, it was kind of pre-Google. And so I was in a phone book going through environmental consulting companies and talked my way into one that was doing bat work. And the reason why consulting companies, if you don't know, do bat work, especially in the eastern half of the US, is because they're endangered bats. There's the Indiana bat. Most recently, there is the northern long-eared bat. Those two drive a lot of consulting or need for Section 7 under Endangered Species Act consultation. You'll hear Section 7 consultation, and that's what that is. The reason why those two endangered bats drive that is because of tree clearing. There are other endangered bats, the Virginia big-eared bat, the gray bat. Both of those are cave obligates. So unless a project is going to impact the cave and it's a known cave where it could be a summer or winter roost, those likely are not going to come up on a project or need for Section 7. So a lot of the driver is Indiana and northern long-eared bats. And my recommendation to everybody in school and slowly and starting to get out of school is to review the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now, since 2014, has range-wide guidance for doing surveys for the Indiana bat, and the northern long-eared bat is covered under those survey guidance document, under that survey guidance document. And that protocol, it came to be because Kentucky, which I think Kelly may have mentioned or Brooke mentioned in her email, I was the bat biologist for Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife for almost 10 years. And we developed statewide guidance document there, and the range-wide survey guidance was kind of based off of that document. And it outlines, the reason for the protocol, and summer guidance, winter guidance, and if you have to do any fall or spring surveys, which are usually called harp trap or spring staging and fall swarming surveys. That's all the guidance is under there. So I strongly recommend searching U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Indiana bat range-wide guidance or guidelines, and that'll kind of get you up to speed on what's required for doing bat surveys. Now, you can't do a bat survey unless you have a permit. And it's really hard to get permits these days. It's really hard to get a federal permit. And all the state permits require you to have a federal permit. And the reason why it's so hard is it's complicated. Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats are endangered. They're really hard to catch, especially after white nose syndrome wiped out a ton of northern long-eared bats. And so being able to, again, I mean, I hate to say it, but volunteering your time to go out and try to partner or, carry things for people that are working with Indiana bats always helps. Brooke has projects in states that I help her with so I routinely get to kind of see Indiana bats, because when I'm doing consulting projects, I never catch Indiana bats, although I'm surveying for them. Most of the time in the eastern U.S., you are catching red bats and big browns. Those are the two most common. And I have some awesome pictures that I can share at some point towards the end. I'll throw up some pictures of migratory bats and hibernating bats and big-eared bats and big clusters and little clusters of bats. So we can kind of go over that, because I'm not sure if anybody knows the difference between a big brown and a red bat, or if you guys have been over that. Most of the time in undergrad, you get to see skins. Or if you've seen live bats, I'm not sure. Has anyone seen a live bat? Yeah. Somewhat, some, sort of. No, not really. Kind of. Okay.
Yes.
So when you start out, and like I said, consulting is a really good place to get she's seen bats. You get your hand down. I know you've seen bats. You've probably seen more bats than I have. So consulting is it's a blessing and a curse. You can get jobs. A lot of consulting companies hire for the summer. They'll send you out. You will not have a life. You will be on the road. You will be traveling, staying in hotels, eating out of gas stations, but you will get a ton of experience. Unfortunately, you're not catching as many bats as you used to. There were nights where I caught hundreds of bats doing projects. That won't happen probably again. Now it's exciting if I catch a few bats. This past summer, I caught 5 red bats one night, and it was just so exciting, So that's the sad part. It's difficult working with bats now, unless you can get some experience with endangered bats and get a federal permit. It's going to be really hard. So I'll just lead with that. But there's a lot of people out there in the Wildlife Society. There's a lot of people that work with U.S. Fish and state agencies, and there's a lot of consultants that will help you get experience. So find a company that you can tolerate, get on with them, and try to get as much experience as you can. It doesn't hurt to also learn how to delineate wetlands, because as a bat biologist for a private consulting company, most of the time you will need to do other things. You need to wear many hats, because you can't just be a specialist. And so knowing how to delineate wetlands, knowing how to do stormwater pollution prevention plans, knowing how to write environmental resource reports for FERC compliance projects, all those fun things will definitely help you to stay full-time employed. If you just want to be seasonal, you can just stick with that. But if you want to have a full-time job and you can't get on in the public sector, private consulting is, like I said, you'll get a lot of experience, but it is a blessing and a curse. So you got to take the good with the bad. One of the things that I wish someone had told me as I was getting out of school was how the private sector and public sector really, but private sector is really driven by the Endangered Species Act, by NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. And not only just those two acts, but what's required under those acts for compliance. NEPA is kind of a big umbrella act, and there's a lot of things that fold into that. So when you're doing NEPA documents, those are environmental impact statements, those are environmental assessments, those are categorical exclusions. And a lot of times when you're working on a project, you'll do a NEPA document. You may write up a categorical exclusion, a no effect memo. They want to know, you have to go through an effects analysis. And I don't know if you covered that at all in any of your coursework, but effects analysis or critical impacts analysis are really important with doing bat work, doing any type of endangered animal work. And it's basically, it's kind of a flow chart in your head. You ask yourself, okay, what is the project? What is the impact? And what are the species it could be impacting? So one of the first things that I do for my job, even state or federal or private sector, whatever, is I run what's called an IPAC. Is everyone familiar with IPACs? They are something U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has online now. It used to be you'd have to write them a letter or an email, but now it's online. It's information. It's for their consultation, and you go online, you create an account, and you can then enter your project area either as a shapefile or you can draw a polygon, and it'll tell you what species will be potentially impacted. It'll give you birds of conservation. It'll give you their wetlands, which I wouldn't rely on the wetlands. The National Wetland Inventory mapping is really outdated and old. So, but it gives you an idea of what the area is going to look like and what impacts. The next thing that you would have to look at would be whatever state you're in. You'd have to go to the state Fish and Wildlife website and pull up county lists of species. And this really is important for bats as well. A lot of states have the bats, Indiana, northern, and most are state listed now, either state threatened or endangered. And that means different things in different states. Some states actually have acts in place where they can prosecute, and they have law enforcement that will go after people doing things to other states, not so much. So really it's the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife. IPAC is a big one. It's information planning and consultation. I'm sorry, I meant to say that earlier, is what IPAC stands for. And it's a fun tool. You know, if you've got a shapefile, you want to draw a polygon, you know, it's fun to look where you live and see what kind of endangered species are supposed to be here. It's just a fun thing to go ahead and create an account and get yourself familiar with, because you'll be running lots of, that's like the first thing you do is run an IPAC. As far as bats go, when I'm working on a project and there could be impacts to bats, you know, you want to make sure that you have an understanding of any programmatic agreements that might be in place. And that's a trickier one. You can search programmatic agreements. You'll come up with some, but some won't be relevant. And a programmatic agreement is something that a state agency will enter into with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they'll say, look, we know, like transportation, federal highways has a programmatic with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that covers impacts within 100 feet of a roadway, paved roadway. If you are impacting with, if you're just doing a road widening within 100 feet and you're clearing trees in the winter, you'll have a no effect. And that's an easy letter. We call that a technical memo. We're having no effect. And we reference the programmatic agreement. We say we're staying within 100 feet. Here's the project. You provide a figure. GIS is a really important thing to know with that work or any other work. Knowing how to do GIS is important. And so knowing if there's programmatics, you know, if when you get hired in as a biologist, you know, these are some of the things that you'll need to have in your wheelhouse. Knowing if there's programmatic agreements that cover the endangered species that you're working with. There are several that are for bats. And then knowing if there are any, if you're going to impact, say you're on a project and you catch an Indiana bat, or you put out a detector and you record calls that are supportive of, you know, Indiana bat calls or northern long-eared bat calls, then you're going to have take, and you're going to have to mitigate for that. And so knowing if there are any conservation funds, knowing how that particular U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office likes to mitigate for bats, is a really good, so having a relationship with a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office that you're working with, and don't be afraid to call them up. If the project is, if the client is wanting confidentiality and they don't want you mentioning the project to federal agencies, you can say, I'm working on a project, and you don't have to give them specifics. And I would like to know, are there any programmatics your office have with, you know, if it's a transportation project with federal highways, if it's sometimes state fish and wildlife agencies have programmatic agreements. I know Kentucky did, because they did a lot of clearing of trees at docks along lakes, and they did not want to be on the hook for paying for every one of those. So that was usually programmatics will cover routine maintenance of X, whatever it is, roadways, docks, that kind of stuff. And these are minimal impacts. And then to offset them, there are, like I said, mitigation can be really creative. I've seen mitigation in the form of Brandon bark, artificial trees being put up, rocket box, bat houses, purchasing land. There's now mitigation banks for bats. There's at least one in Missouri that I know of where you can buy credits. And then the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund in Kentucky is another one where you can basically pay per acre for impact, and there'll be ratios for that. But doing bat work is it can be just knowing the loopholes and the red tape, jumping through those to be able to get what you need for work or for your client, and for research. As Brooke knows, trying to do any work in any state, you have to know what can you do with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're getting very, very picky about who they give permits to and what they allow those people to do with those permits. It used to be you could get a permit, you could wing punch, you could pit tag, you could put light tags on bats, but now a lot of that is very project specific, and they will give you a short window to do it in. So if you're, let's say you've got experience, or let's say you get hired on at state agency, or let's say that you want to continue on to get your master's or your PhD, and you want to work with bats. The questions that you have or you're wanting to answer is what's going to drive you, or more importantly, whatever there's funding for is what's going to drive your degree. So if there's funding for a project, and that may not be your dream project, but it'll get you a master's degree, I encourage you to go that route, simply because it doesn't matter to an employer what you focused your thesis or your PhD on. They just like seeing that you have those acronyms behind your name. If you want to go, if you want to go into research, a PhD is almost a requirement at this point. Getting on in private sector, I would say a PhD it's getting to the point where there's a lot of PhDs. I see a lot of PhDs being hired in, even entry level now. Master's degrees I think are still important, but if you're debating on which one to go with, I would recommend a PhD. I did a master's degree, and I a little bit regret it, just because I think a PhD is, they really do like seeing those letters behind your name, and it's difficult. A PhD is a difficult thing to get. The people that get PhDs have put in a lot of time and work and effort, and they deserve the credit and the accolades that go with it. But that if you want to work with bats and you're struggling to get experience, I would apply. There's always companies that are hiring for technicians during the summer. They will typically give you a per diem. They will give you a hotel. And as long as you don't mind being shipped from one state to the next, you'll get experience doing bat work with federally permitted people. And then that will help you get your permit. It's really hard to do bat work without a permit, especially if you want to do any endangered bat work. And I predict in the next few years, we'll see more listings. I think the little brown bat will come up. I think the tricolored bat will probably come up. And so it's going to be harder and harder to do bat work without a permit. So that would be the first hurdle that would need to be crossed. And in the Northeast, where you all are, the Northeast is weird. It's Region 5 for U.S. Fish, and they still don't require a federal permit up there. So there's states that fall in, you can look up U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. You'll see Region 5, and you'll see it's those New England states up in there. That is state by state, and their state permit requirements are pretty hefty. So I don't know if anyone's went through the process of applying for a state permit, but the Pennsylvania permits are pretty intense. Brooke can maybe speak to you or give you advice on getting New Jersey permits. I know she's dealt with them. I worked in Region 4. Region 4 and 3 require a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's called a Section 10 permit. And section, or go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
You are now.
Okay, I didn't know if I could unmute or if Kelly was going to keep me quiet. I just wanted to say, so in New Jersey, it's weird because for that, we don't need a separate federal permit for bat work. So if we want to go and collect samples from Indiana bats or northern long-eared, it's only a state permit. And there's some, I don't know, some cooperative agreement or something between New Jersey and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's how it works. So it's kind of weird, but that's not true in most cases. In most other cases. Yeah. And
they may be covering those states under Section 6 agreements. Because I know in Kentucky, I did not have to have a federal permit when I worked at the state. We were covered under what was called a Section 6 agreement. Section 6 under Endangered Species Act is how the feds kind of hand over some of that power to the states to be able to do sampling, to do surveys. I did all the hibernaculus surveys. I handled lots of endangered bats for WNS. For inventory purposes, and I never had a federal permit. In Section 10 so there's a few sections that are important under Endangered Species Act. Section 7 is the big one. That's the consultation one. That's the one where that drives a lot of the work that's done with bats is under Section 7. And the reason why Section 7 is an important one to know, regardless of whether you're going into private sector or public sector work, is, that's if there's a federal nexus at all with a project you're working on, if you have to apply for a Clean Water Act Section 404 permit, if you have to apply for if you have to apply for a 401 under Clean Water Act, then that nexus is what triggers a lot of the work that is done for bats across the U.S. And there's tons of research going on with bats, but even more than that, there are thousands of consultants out there every summer putting up nets and putting out detectors collecting bats. And so a lot of the occurrence records that you see that your state and federal agencies have is from consultants doing the bulk of the work. I mean, there's only a few state people that go out for state fish and wildlife, and there's only so many researchers that get out in the field, but there's consultants everywhere that are out there, and so, like I said, that's a good place to get a ton of experience. The other important section under endangered species is Section 10, and it's kind of a two-tiered section. So Section 10 it covers permitting, which is what it's called a recovery permit. And that's the federal permit that it's good to have in regions 3 and 4 if you're doing any federal bat work. Region 3 is Midwest, Region 4 is Southeast. But there's also Section 10 covers any work that's done under, it's kind of the private landowner section of Section 7. So there's no federal nexus, but a lot of wind farms, when they want to build turbines, they need to figure out how they're going to offset those impacts. And they may not be applying for any other federal permit, but because they're known to have such detrimental impacts, there's a lot of bat strikes and bird strikes at wind, then they have to come up with what's called habitat conservation plans, or HCPs. And those are covered under Section 10 as well. So anytime there's a private permit, either a recovery permit that an individual or a company gets, or a habitat conservation plan, those are covered under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. So, knowing policy and knowing how Endangered Species Act works when it comes to bats, and there's a lot of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service websites will have information on there. I know the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office in Kentucky, the Kentucky field office, they have a really good web page that talks about working with bats in Kentucky, but really covers kind of broader, what goes on there kind of covers all of Region 4. So while it says working with bats in Kentucky, it applies to all of the Southeast and most of the Midwest too. And it gives you a really nice breakdown of what the northern long-eared bat 4D rule is. Does everybody know the northern long-eared bat was recently listed a few years ago, and there's a 4D rule. And the 4D rule is interesting. There's only a few species that have 4D rules. And in my opinion, a 4D rule is done when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has basically given into lobbyists of either oil and gas, timber, state fish and wildlife agencies. And I say that because I was present in the process of doing the northern long-eared bat 4D rule, and it really was driven by, special interest groups lobbying, basically on timber. They didn't want to see another Indiana bat, and they wanted some time. And so I think, I don't know if you all know, but very recently, within the last few months, a court struck down the 4D rule, said it was arbitrary and capricious, that the reason why they gave them a 4D rule is U.S. Fish argued that the only reason why they were listing it was because of impacts to white nose, not because of habitat degradation. So therefore, if trees are not a limiting factor for northern long-eared bats, then cutting trees should not impact northern long-eared bats. And that was why they gave them the 4D rule. So they haven't come out with their final ruling yet, but there's people in both camps. There's people in one camp that say it won't go endangered, but now I think because there's a new administration coming in, I think there's a lot better chance that bat's going to go endangered. It should have went endangered in the first place. There really wasn't a reason why, a legitimate reason why it didn't, except because the timber industry had money and lobbied. So, and that is a sucky truth to working with bats, or really in any endangered species. Bats are really high profile because anytime there's tree clearing, which a lot of oil and gas, a lot of coal mining, energy development in general will take trees, and they don't want to clear in the winter because winter clearing is really hard on the people doing it. It's hard on the environment. There's a lot of runoff. There's a lot of sedimentation that goes on. So it's a balancing act. When you're starting to think about a career with bats, I would definitely take into account, it's an uphill battle right now with just getting the experience to get federal permits. So my recommendation would be, regardless of whether or not you want a long career in consulting, would be to get on with a consulting company. And I would get on with a smaller ecological company, not a big engineering company. The smaller ecological companies will give you a lot more experience. They'll have biologists that have been with them for a long time. Turnover rate at places like where I work for junior level or younger biologists is really high because it's not the kind of work that they're wanting to do. I'm a mom and I don't like being gone all summer. So I still do bat work, but I'm only gone about a month out of the summer, where I used to be gone spring, summer, and fall. But with smaller ecological companies, you will get the experience, the field work, and you'll get to know people. A lot of any job is networking. And so once you're going out there, the group of people that you will know that are doing bat work, you will continue to know them for the next 20, 30 years. They will be the people that you'll see at meetings all the time. They will be the people that will become regulatory, become PhDs. They may be hiring you. Someone may be your technician, and then 5 years later, they may be hiring you. So keep that in mind. Be nice to everybody. Because people that you were your techs can then be, hiring you in. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some people go different ways, and then, but you will know these people that you're working with as you're going out into the field and going out to professional careers. You will see them over and over and over again. And, yeah, and bat people are weird. I mean, Brooke can tell you, we're weird people. The bat people that go into caves, that really like caving, and I will distinguish myself. I am not a caver. I went into caves to look for bats. People that are cavers are super weird. And I'm saying that with some adoration, but also they're just weird people, okay? They have like naked caving events. And yes, they do. These are very common. Yes. but they can become some of your best buddies. If you need to know where bats are, don't count caving groups out. They know, they have been responsible for finding more hibernacula than any biologist. And if you're nice to them, they will tell you where they're at. So even though they're weird, you always be nice to the cavers because they typically have a lot of information. I have some bat pictures that I can share if anybody wants to see some bat pictures.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to like caving.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any like resistance from like cavers just with white nose syndrome? Like,
oh yeah. So that's a good question. When white nose first hit in New York, I was the state bat biologist. I'd been there for by the time that we started talking about it, I'd been there maybe 6 months. I just was hired in. And what happened in some states was like Tennessee, they had a really difficult time with their caving group. And some of the New England states had a difficult time because they tried to ban caving. And the reason why I use these fingers is because state fish and wildlife agencies have no regulatory authority over private land. And if most of the caves are on private land. And so while they're state-owned caves and they have jurisdiction over those, or they have sister agency like parks or state parks that, they can have closures and regulations over those. There can be some regulations over commercial caves, but like in Kentucky, 95% of the caves were privately owned. And we had a good relationship with our caving groups because we never tried to overstep. And so one of the things I did when white nose hit is I got a bunch of donations of Tyvek, a bunch of donations of Lysol. I went to every single group and I donated decontamination stuff, courtesy of State Fish and Wildlife, just to keep those lines of communication open. I know in some other states, they took the exact opposite approach. And I think they're still paying for that because once those relationships are broken, it's difficult to re-engage those groups again, because that's their fear, is if they show you that there's bats, that they won't be able to go in those caves anymore. And they do like caving in the winter. And so it's tricky, you gotta, they're impacting the bats, but you try to balance it with, educating them. And most of the time it works. Most of the time they'll stay out, during hibernation. They'll try to go in, no later than the fall and then start going back in the spring. But there was pushback, of course, because they did not want, that's an important thing to that community, is to be able to go to those caves. But the big hibernacula are mostly protected. The most of the time they're not going in those. It was tricky. There was a big, it was called Crawlathon in Kentucky. And we made a decision about 2 weeks prior to Crawlathon. Usually there was about 800 people that would come in from internationally. And it was a big caving event. And it was at Carter Cave State Resort Park, where there's 2 big priority 1 Indiana bat hibernacula. And they wouldn't go through the hibernacula, but they would go around in other caves. And because we were so afraid about white nose and we didn't know what it was, this was still back when we weren't sure what it was. We canceled it, and I had to go give a talk, and I had to be escorted by state troopers because they were afraid. There was people that were not happy, and there were very unhappy people there. But a lot of the people there that were unhappy, and some of the cavers, they're older men, and they stuck cotton balls on the end of their nose and like glared at me from the back of the room. After a couple of years, they were buddies. They realized it wasn't just the thing we were using to try to close down. We started seeing the impacts of white nose in Kentucky a few years later. Hundreds, thousands of dead bats at the entrances of caves, and so it became a real thing. It's not any different than coronavirus. There are people that don't believe that coronavirus is a real thing. And there are people that have suffered directly from it. So, it's similar with that. But yeah, and getting experience with caving, if you're interested in doing that, join your caving group. You know, they're weird people, but they're nice people. If you want to do naked caving, you go do that. You know, no judgment here. I didn't do it, but that was something they did. But that's another good way, because there's two types of experience. There's in-hand experience, which is easy. Once you have a bat in hand, you can key it out, you can take pictures, you can look at it later if you've misidentified it in the field, which you will, and then correctly identify it later. But when you're looking at a bat hibernating, you can't touch it, and you only get to see typically one side and a nose that's probably covered in condensation. And sometimes you're going to be right, and sometimes you're going to be wrong. But the only way to be able to see those bats is to be able to get in the caves. And the only way to get in the caves is, I would strongly recommend organized caving. I would not go off on your own. A lot of the caving groups follow decontamination protocols. A lot of them, you know, are really good about that. If you join up with a group that's not, find another group, you know, because you definitely, at this point, I would say in the Northeast, white nose is probably in most caves, if not all of the known ones. You know, bats are really good at carrying the spores around, but I would still follow the decontamination protocols, and make sure that the group you're with is doing that as well. And that type of experience is important too. You know, there's a lot of work coming out that state agencies are contracting out because they don't have the staff or they don't have the experience, and they need to know, you know, what are their bats doing in their hibernacula. You know, in Kentucky, I think I surveyed between 40 and 50 caves a year. And I myself went in most of those, but I would have to contract some of them out to consultants to help with. So knowing how to ID bats in the winter, and there are winter hibernating bat keys that state agencies have. And I think I have a PowerPoint that I can maybe shoot over to Kelly, and she could send the group how to ID hibernating bats, because it is really tricky. You don't want to touch them or wake them up. You want to try to be as quiet as possible when you're in there, because they do wake up, and it's hard on them once they arouse. They can only do that so many times before it's really detrimental to them. So does anybody else have any questions? I know you were saving questions till the end, but I feel like I'm rambling.
So. You can ask. Yeah.
And I look like a ghost.
I like that you have your cat in your background.
Oh yeah, I got a cat back there. That's the buttons.
Oh, so cute. From my experience, I've only been able to see one Myotis bat in the field, but it was like really hard to ID that even with it in hand. So I can't even imagine what that would be like in a cave where you can't touch, like look at the little toe hairs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Myotis are the worst when it comes to IDing. They're what we call, like, if anyone's a birder, I think a lot of birders know the joke of the little brown bird, the LBBs. That's little brown bats. They all look like little brown bats. Even the big brown bats sometimes look like little brown bats when they're just in a little ball on the wall. So yeah, I mean, but that's a good point. You know, size of these bats, you know, once you have a bat in hand and you've held a gray bat versus an Indiana bat, you will see, you know, there's a gram difference or two. There's a few millimeters forearm length difference, but you'll feel it's a little bit heavier. But hibernating wise, it's really hard to tell the difference between a gray bat and an Indiana bat. The only way to tell them is if you know, they're clustering in caves, they hang totally different. And formation of bats during hibernation is an important way to tell them apart. Gray bats like to hang like this on a cave wall or ceiling, and they'll hang on top of each other. They have like a chaining effect where they'll hang one on top of each other. Indiana bats like to cluster all from a center point, and they'll be mixed. You'll have northerns and little browns in with Indianas. Let me show you a quick picture of it. Let's see, how do I do this? I can open this up and then share my screen. Let's see.
There's a green button on the bottom. You should be able to share it.
All right. Can you guys see this bat?
Yeah.
Yep.
So that is a close-up of a little brown bat, and you can see, you know, the dark forearms and the dark face. And here's a close-up of one with a band on. I don't know if anyone's had any experience with banding bats yet. That
Yep.
definitely takes a finesse because they can very easily be put on wrong.
You ever use the bands to just help with your ID process? Like, do you ever look up the band to see?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. The bands are very important. And during hibernacular counts, anytime you find a band, you got to record it, and then you trace it back to the state agency. There'll be a little set of numbers and letters on there, and then they can tell you who banded it and where. And that's how we get our migration records. That's really the only way we get our migration. The longest migration record from Indiana bat was from Pennsylvania to Kentucky. We found a banded Indiana bat in a cave in Kentucky, traced it to being banded in Pennsylvania. I think it was 490 miles that bat flew. It flew over tons of suitable hibernacula to go to that hibernacula. So the reason why, who knows? So this is
my job last summer, I was working for the the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife with a bat biologist. And we started working with a master's student out of Virginia Tech who's using MODIS tags to track bats. So we were tagging them in southern New Jersey, and he tracked them that way.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Did he get data on them?
Yeah. So
did?
we were able to watch it basically in time, like fly over the Delaware Bay, which was really cool. He's just interested to know if they would fly over land or if they would make that trip over water, and it made the trip over water in 4 hours.
What bat was it?
It was a red bat.
It was a red bat. Okay. Yeah, because it's hard to get those. Myotis are so little, it's hard to get anything that small. But this is a picture of of gray bats hibernating. And you can kind of see how they look. They just look like they've been splatted onto this wall, and that's how gray bats like to hibernate. This cave had 300,000 plus. We would go in and we would count square meters. So I had a meter square kind of a frame, and I would hold them up, and I would have my technicians calculate temperature and humidity. And for each section, when we would see them, like that, where they're kind of spread out, we would get density estimates, and that's how we would count the bats. All population counts and hibernacular estimates, they're never accurate. You're guessing at this point when you have hundreds of thousands of bats. Wow. This is one of my favorites. I took this picture of a cluster. So this was in Kentucky. You can see in this cluster, there's a banded. This is an old plastic band, and you can see I love that albino bat. It's one of my favorites.
That's so cute. It's like a little cotton.
It does look like a little cotton ball.
Is that to find one?
No. I've only seen one, and in all my time of going in caves, I've seen bats that have mottling on their fur and their wings, but it's not albinism. This is one of my favorite bats. It's a Virginia big-eared bat. I love this picture. These bats are really chill when you catch them. They don't try to rip your face off or anything. So I just think the bunny-eared bats, I don't think you guys have these in New Jersey. I think the big-eared bats are more south, but this is a federally endangered bat. It's a cave obligate rooster. And those ears are, a couple inches. And when they hibernate, they will curl them back like ram's horns.
Wow.
It's just ridiculously cute.
That's really cute. That's why I like red bats, because they're pretty chill when you hold them.
Red bats can also have flip top heads. They can bite you. Their heads will open like this, and then they can bite you basically from any angle, so you got to watch them. But yeah, they are some of the more pretty bats. I think I have some bat photos of them somewhere. This is a big brown bat I caught on I-75, Interstate 75 widening project. We caught a big brown. I caught a few of them. And you can tell, that's a typical big brown. They have these big musk glands. They're definitely bigger than the little brown, about twice the size. Sometimes you'll get bats that look like this in a cave, and you've got to ID them. And these are what's affectionately known. Those are Indiana bats. Those are affectionately known as crack bats. The crack bats are the worst to identify because they basically just look like a bunch of things in a crack.
Hey, Brooke,
Yeah,
can you just show Cadis the big-eared bat again?
yeah. There it is.
Isn't it adorable?
I know.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. So this was a presentation I did a long time ago. I'm definitely not going to bore you all with a presentation of bats, but I have some good pictures in here. It was specific to Kentucky, but this would apply to the Eastern US basically. You know, you've got 4 endangered bats. This is the Virginia big-eared. These are the 2 Indiana and Northern. That's a Northern Indiana, and then that's the gray bat. It's really hard to tell. They're all like wanting to eat the camera, but only the big-eared is the chill one. So this is what so yeah, you can see in this picture, some of their ears are curled, but they pop out. This is kind of what they look like hanging. These are the gray bats. So this is what it looks like in a cave when you're trying to count them. And they wake up very easily and they will fly into you. They will fly on the ground. You got to be careful. This is a picture of some of that chaining effect where they just like stack on each other. Gray bats are the weirdest bats to me. When they arouse very easily, and then they will basically drop off the ceiling into the water. They will chain all the way down a ceiling onto the wall, and you can see raccoon prints. Raccoons love eating bats. Raccoons are the worst. And cats, even though I got a cat. They're the worst when it comes to eating bats. They will go in and they'll just eat bats. There's that picture. Like I said, I've used this picture a lot. Hibernating gray Indiana bats. That's an old W nest. So here's the northern long-eared bat. One of the things about northern long-eared bats that makes them easy to identify is they have this symmetrical long tragus in their ear. And when you see that, you know, Indiana's, grays, northerns, none of them have that long of a tragus. And that really is kind of the distinguishing thing with them. I don't know if I've got a close up. I don't know if I've got any of an Indiana's tragus, and you will misidentify bats. Anyone that says they haven't, they're fibbing. Everybody misidentifies bats. It happens. They're hard to do in hand. They're even harder in caves. And so here's the little brown. These are like I said, the possible future listings. The tricolored at the bottom, you can see kind of the pink on black with the wings. That's a kind of and also they're tricolored fur. So if you blow on their fur, which you're not supposed to do anymore because of COVID, but if you separate their fur, don't blow on bats anymore. That's a big no-no.
What about like look at their nipples? Isn't that like
I know you've got to like use your finger and apologize a lot because that's super. It's like you can't ask for permission to play with a bat's nipple. So yeah, you're just gonna have to do it. But the hair at the base is dark, and then it's a light band in the middle. Then it's a dark tip, hence the tricolored bat, the tricolored name. Little brown bats. Little brown bats are tough, you know. Basically, it's a little brown bat. It's not kind of gray, and if it doesn't have keeled cow car, and if it's got long toe hair, then it's a little brown bat. But it's difficult, even using those metrics, which we've used for decades. We still found that people were misidentifying bats, and that was one of the things that I really was trying to kind of hone in on. Was what other metrics can we be using to correctly identify bats? And this area of the wing that's attached above the forearm. Measuring that, especially for northern long-eared bats, that seemed to be an indicator that, and then muscle striations in the tail on northern long-eared bats. Usually northern long-eared bats have, I think it was 10 or 12, and the other ones don't, and they have a certain amount of wing membrane above their forearm where little browns and Indianas do not. So yeah, digging down into those. You can't take enough pictures, and you can't take enough pictures with a ruler, beside, whatever it is, and clearly showing, because I am horrible at taking pictures and it always bites me. Someone's like, I go, I caught this bat and had this. Did you take a picture? No. And so they're like, well, it didn't exist if you didn't take a picture. So So take pictures, be a better field biologist. I still got in the field after doing this for 20 some years. And the first time I got in the field, it's like, I've never been in the field before. I forget my data sheets. I sometimes don't even have a thing to write with because everything's so digital. I will take notes in my phone, in my notes app, because I forgot paper. So you can never be too prepared as a field biologist, but take pictures. So this one, this Raffinus bigger bat, it is truly my favorite bat. My daughter is named Coraline, but I came up with Cora because Raffinus bigger bats or Corinarhinus raffinesci. So we called them Cora bats, and they look exactly like Virginia bigger bats, except they're grayish white, but the ears are the same. And they're just the cutest. So they're cute little bats. They're big little bunny ears. So there's 2 big-eared bats in eastern United States. Here's some solitary roosting. So if you're in a cave and you see just one bat hanging out by itself, probably one of these guys. It's a big brown if it's pretty big. If it's tiny, it's a tricolored. If it's ridiculously tiny, it's a small-footed bat. You guys have small-footed bats up there. They look like little browns, but they have a black mask on them. They're really hard to tell the difference. The only way is because they roost singly. Little browns usually roost in a cluster or a line. Indiana's most of the time roost in a cluster. So these are the ones that you'd see by themselves. Now here's a bat you may or may not see. It's not federally listed. It's called the southeastern bat. It's a Myotis austroriparius. And it is a weird bat in the sense that when in the summertime, it is orange. It looks almost like a red bat, except it's not. It's a Myotis. But in the winter, it becomes gray with white underbelly. These are very common in the Southeast, hence the name Southeastern. Recently, a hibernacule was found in Alabama. They thought that they had always had Southeasterns, but somebody apparently went in, identified those Southeasterns as being Indianas, or at least some of them. And so now there's a new Indiana bat hibernacula in Alabama. So the Indiana bats range is expanding. And the ranges of these bats will expand and contract based on these environmental pressures that are being put on them. White nose, wind, they will move. Climate change is a big, I think we're going to start seeing Mexican free-tailed bats more commonly in Kentucky. Wow. There was a historic record of one in Callaway County in the 70s. No one's really seen one since, but they're very common in Tennessee. So I think as climate change messes with climates and pushes up, those ranges of those bats in the Southeast will start coming up north. So you talked about the red bat. I will get to that one. That's the most common migrating bat. So evening bats are another one that they look like little browns. Teeth dentation. If you all have looked at or started to look at teeth dentation, I remember doing that in my mammalogy class. You had to count teeth, and I thought it was the dumbest thing in the world. But I end up having to count teeth on bats when I'm holding, especially sometimes you'll get a big brown and it'll seem small and it's an adult, and you'll have to ask yourself, could it be an evening bat? Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. The evening bats range is changing too. They're starting to see them up in northern Michigan where they had never seen them before. But they look just like they look like juvenile big browns. So being able, but they smell like bad Chinese food. So it's the musclans. Big browns stink too, but evening bats smell like bad Chinese food. Big browns just stink. They smell like animal pee, but I think
how does smell come off of one?
They have musk glands on their noses. That's why their noses, I don't know if you can see this right here, but it looks kind of poofy, and that's a musk gland. Big browns have it too. But yeah, just like bad lo mein or something. I don't know. They stink. And but the teeth dentation is how you tell an evening bat from a big brown. And so knowing those types of things will help you correctly ID. These are hard things to find in books. These are things, forearm length wasn't in a lot of books. Mammals of Missouri was a one I used a lot to help me ID bats, but really just field experience. And it's tough now to get field experience with bats. And so the red bat, eastern red bat, is one of the most common bats. I catch that bat all the time. It's a beautiful bat. Got this orangish hair with white tips. It looks like, I always thought it looked like it had an Elizabethan collar around it. They have flip top heads. The nice thing about red bats, a lot of the migrating bats will have fur on their tails. If you hold it gently with just one thumb over in your hand, you hold the head just gently, and you pet the back of a red bat, its back feet will flip up and touch over its back. It's a cool trick. You can impress your friends with petting red bats. Yes.
It's like the softest fur ever too.
They do. And the Seminole bat is just as beautiful. It's more of a mahogany purplish color. It migrates through the southeastern states. It's common in Florida. It hangs out in Spanish moss. You may or may not ever see one of these. They're not federally listed, so you wouldn't be out looking for them. But if you're doing work in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, any of those states, you'll catch Mississippi. These are pretty common. And their ranges overlap. So red bats and Seminoles ranges overlap. And so it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between the two. Again, it's pictures. The hoary bat, this isn't the greatest picture it's taken up, but it's the biggest bat in the eastern US. It is about, I would say, maybe 5 inches, 4 or 5 inches. It's beautifully colored. They're pretty docile, which is good because they too have flip top heads, and they're just gorgeous bats. I've caught those in weird situations, but it always seems like they correlate. I just remember catching a lot in higher elevations in West Virginia, 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet, near ponds. So, but I mean, you can catch them in low areas too.
Netted one for the first time last summer. It was really exciting.
Yeah, they're beautiful bats. Silver-haired bat is always going to be one of my favorites. They look like little bears. They have little rounded black ears. They're black with these bright white tips on their backs. It's the first bat I've ever caught and handled. And you don't catch them a lot. Silver-haired bats, you don't see them a lot either. Sometimes you'll see them at the entrance caves. They'll be roosting just by themselves, hanging out at the end of the cave. I haven't caught one in years, but when you catch them, you know it. I did catch one in West Virginia a long time ago, early on in my career, and it had mange. It didn't have any hair on its back.
Wow.
And I did not know what that bat was. I could not figure out what that bat was. And I finally deduced after several hours of looking at books and that kind of stuff that it was a silver-haired bat, but it was missing its one characteristic. Its ears were all mangled from mites, this poor bat. But so it's a rare one to catch. I would say it's more rare than any of the endangered ones I've ever tried to catch. I think it's more of a western bat, South Dakota, that kind of stuff. But yeah, a beautiful bat if you ever get your hands on one. Here's the Mexican free-tailed bat. This guy was a technician, but he was very excited about holding this bat. And these were two. You can see the tail there. We caught these in Arizona, so I know one's a Mexican free-tailed bat and one is another. I can't remember which is. I don't know. One's bigger and one's smaller. The Mexican free-tailed bats are bigger, and then there's a smaller one that's in the same genus, but I can't remember the species name on that one. But they have very velvety fur. Their fur feels like none of the other bats. And they're obviously, I mean, they have that weird naked tail, so it's very obvious what they are. And most of the time, unless you're netting out in Arizona or New Mexico, you're going to just catch Mexican free-tailed bats. But when you start to get out west, you start to get into their other bat species. Then we talked a little bit about impacts to migratory bats. And this is why a lot of, migratory bats are not listed yet. I think it's horrible that state agencies are not doing more for tracking and getting more information about migratory bats, because we have no idea what the populations are with these bats. We only know populations based on hibernaculum. And so when bats don't hibernate, we have no idea. And so we've always just assumed or thought red bats are really common, hoary bats aren't that common, but they're still pretty common. But now with these impacts to wind, now we just don't know. And so trying to base an argument for listing red bats with the amount of death that occurs at wind turbines, it's going to be difficult because we have no baseline. So we can't really show how much we've lost because we never knew how much we really had for these bats. So I really wish that state agencies, because they're not federally listed, so there's no federal money, there's no federal driver to go out and look for these bats or to do really a lot of work with them, but they are going to be, they're going to be hitting the lists because there's just so much. Hundreds of thousands of these bats are killed every year by turbines. And those are red bats, hoary bats. This was a federally listed bat out west, the lesser long-nosed bat. I got a chance to go out and pit tag with these a few years back, and just amazing bats. I mean, they're big, but they are so docile and so cool. And it's drinking sugar water out of a little cap. But when we were catching them, you're not supposed to give animals sugar water anymore. But I mean, these bats pollinate agave cactus, which is where tequila comes from. So, next time you're hating life because you drank too much tequila, you can think about it. And so, I don't know if anyone's been able to go out netting, but this is kind of what a typical net looks like. And getting a bat out of a net, it looks like a giant hair net, and lots of tangling goes on. But hopefully you will have someone that will show you how to properly get a bat out. That was what I was always more worried about when I was training people than them knowing how to ID, was just how to handle bats, because I had seen people break wings, and you can break wings very easily. But just take your time, check your nets often, so they don't get in there and get tangled. If you don't check your nets often, they will eat their way out. They will get tangled. They will stress. So think about the bat when you're out, and try to think about, you don't want to leave them in the net long. I think checking nets every 10 minutes is probably a good habit to get into. You just don't want to leave them hanging. I've seen frogs try to eat bats out of nets. I've come back to my net and seen an owl roosting near it. I've had technicians who've had bat parts in their nets because an owl ate a bat. I mean, that's just like the worst thing I can think of, is being eaten alive out of a net. So check your nets often. And I don't know if acoustics are becoming a big thing. There's lots of different detector types out there. Getting a handle on how to use acoustic devices and doing a workshop. A lot of workshops were free and still are through Wildlife Acoustics and Titley. A lot of companies will pay for their people to go get trained. But knowing how to vet calls is what it's called, or manually run calls. We have automated programs now, but you almost always have to manually vet Myotis calls because they're so difficult. And knowing things like red bats, when they're foraging in clutter, they elicit calls that look exactly like Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats. So knowing those types of things. If you have bat calls, just, running through them. If you know anybody else that does a lot of call ID, see if they're willing to, show you some tips, but it just takes hours and hours of going through calls to get good at it. Once you've mastered how to do the automated part, it really is just repetition, getting graphs of calls and comparing the calls that you're looking at to those graphs and making guesses, sending them off to someone and saying, is this what I think it is? And that's how you get good at that, because that is kind of where we're going. A lot of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service banned handling of bats this past summer for half the summer. And so I had projects that I was supposed to be netting on that I had to then shift and go put out detectors. And then you have to run calls every day, because it's just like, if you get an endangered bat call, you've got to let state and federal agencies know within 24 to 48 hours, just like if you have an endangered bat in hand. And you have to make sure that you know what you're talking about, because you have to be able to, if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which they did, they came back to me on a project of mine and wanted to see more information about some calls. And we went back and forth, and knowing what you're talking about, obviously, when you're talking with a regulator, and but also being able to say, I'll look at it again. I don't know. I don't, we thought it was this, and we'll look at it again. And it ended up, it wasn't an endangered bat. The call wasn't good enough. There's protocols where you have to have so many pulses for it to be a certain type of call. And it has to go through, kind of some filters. You can have some bad calls that are flagged. You have calls that are flagged as endangered bat calls that aren't really. So you have to know what you're looking at. This is a picture of a harp trap. And these are used, you can use these in certain situations, not on caves. I've only ever used one on a cave. And this is the preferred method for catching bats coming out of caves. It's very low stress. They fly into these fishing lines, and they kind of float down into or fall down into the bag, and then they can roost in the bag as you're processing them. And it's not as stressful as being in a net. They're protected. They can't get eaten. They can kind of roost together where they don't get too cold, or they can separate where they don't get too hot. You can have, a few hundred in a bag and process them. So this is kind of the preferred method for doing any mine portal or cave trapping. And just picture action shots of processing and letting bats go. I don't know if this will play or not. This is, let's see if this will play. This is letting go of a big-eared. I always like those photos or those videos. So anyway, okay, I've talked way too long. I'm done.
Thank you for that.
Yay, bats!
Yeah.
So, does anyone have any questions? Have I discouraged everyone from going to work with bats? Hopefully not, but I just want to let
anything will discourage me.
Good. It's difficult. Let me see. Let me flip back over to the screen. Let me shut this down and see here.
So it's my understanding that you have to have a certain amount of handling experience with these federally endangered bats to be able to apply for your own permit. Is that something that's really difficult to do?
It can be, yeah. Sorry, I've lost my way on how to become a video. Where is?
Maybe I can make you stop this.
It's the same button that was like share screen.
I know. Now I just have
top.
a picture of. Now I just have you all. I don't know. I don't see. Oh, here it is. There's that sharing. Here we go. New share. Back over here. Okay. It is that so it's difficult to get experience with bats. But if you know who to talk to, Brooke's a good source of them. She can kind of pawn you off on people that may be going out in the field, or if you're nice enough to her, she may let you go out and watch her do things. If you carry things for her and bring her snacks, that's always my thing. Bring me snacks, I will let you see bats. Consulting companies, they're always looking to hire, especially once you start looking at job boards in about January, February, March, and you'll start seeing jobs popping up for work with bats. They'll be wanting people differing levels. Sometimes you just need someone that can carry stuff and help set up, and that's if you don't have any experience and you don't have a federal or state permit. That's what you'll be doing, is helping set up and carrying things. And it's all good experience, because it's good to see how people set up their nets. Everybody sets up their nets differently. Knowing ask questions. Why are you setting the net up there? That is one of the most important things to learn, is why are they setting the net where they're setting it? Why are they setting it here instead of here? And talk to them and try to think about, does that make sense to you? Ask questions, ask polite questions. Sometimes people don't like to be questioned, but if you ask it in the right way, they will be more than happy to share information with you and talk and help you learn. And that's what you're there to do. You're there to learn. Even people that have been doing this 20 or 30 years, we still just, how did you do this? Well, when you set up a net like over there, why did you not set up over here? You learn over time. You'll see spot that looks like it's perfect. You catch nothing. And then you'll see a spot that, it's like, nah, maybe I'll try that. Now service will let you move your nets every night. They used to not. You used to have to pick a spot and you used to net there for 2 nights. Now they'll let you move nets around. And up where you guys are at, it's almost cost prohibitive for companies to net, because some of the netting can be 42 net nights, depending on where you're at, because of white nose. Here, or not here, but in the Southeast, it's still 9 net nights. So you can get, most of your netting done in 2 nights. And I think in West Virginia, it's 9 net nights. You have to have 10 nets up. If you're really good and you've got a really good technician, you can set up 5 nets and run 5 nets in one night. I've done it. It's exciting. You're not catching a lot of bats anymore. We had 5 nets up for 2 nights. I caught 1 bat. So, and in Kentucky or the Southeast, I think their netting protocol is they want you to put up 1 net for 2 nights now. And you can move it around. You can move it from one spot to the next. And I move my nets quite a bit, because I'll think, oh, this spot looked really good. And then the next day when I've got more time, or, when I've looked at the site more, I'll move it to another spot. So it can be difficult. Yeah.
I've had a 40 net night.
Yeah.
I mean, a 40 bat night. There was I wasn't there, but I heard about it. It sounded insane.
That is, especially if it's all big browns, because they're very bitey. They're the ones you need gloves for. I'm getting into a habit of wearing gloves. You should all wear gloves. You should wear like baseball or golf or softball gloves for most of the bats, but have a nice pair of leather gloves that you can manipulate the net with, but leather, because big browns can bite through. These bats can bite through nitrile gloves, even red bats, but you can, but where golf gloves or baseball or softball gloves work for the most part. But for big browns, I would recommend getting leather gloves as well. Someone asked if I'd ever seen a ghost bat. I've not seen a ghost bat. I would like to. There's a lot of bats I've not seen. I don't feel like I know anything. I've just been doing it a long time. Sorry. She wants to know if she can play on her phone. No. School's over. Now they have nothing to do.
Yeah, I guess it would be kind of crazy to go to the tropics and net there. It'd be a whole new experience.
Yep. It would be awesome. I've been to Belize, but and I've seen bats swooping, pools, but we didn't get to catch any. So one of these days somebody needs to go to the Bahamas and net bats. I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's on the back burner, and
I know.
house somewhere.
It should be moved to the front. We all need to go to the Bahamas.
We do. I'll work on it in my spare time.
Yeah, I told Brooke I will bring her snacks and I will carry all the gear. I'll set it all up. All she has to do is just come out, look beautiful, say, I'm here, and let it begin.
There you go.
There you go.
It's true though. We net bats every summer in my lab. Kelly knows that. And we didn't do it this year, but hopefully things will change, and next year we'll be looking for some people. So you should definitely, Kelly, remind the Wildlife Society group. There's not too many on the call today, I think, because it's term projects and getting, it's that time of year. But yeah, we usually have probably like 5 or 6 people out there. And you don't need a rabies shot to help out. You just can't handle anything. Otherwise, if you get bitten, I have to go and get myself in trouble. Get sent.
Get Brooke in trouble.
Yeah, that happened 2 years ago, because we did have, I think we had 60 bats, 65 bats. It was chaos, complete chaos. But I think we must have been netting near a maternity colony or something, because it was like bananas. So, and somebody got bit.
Yeah. It happens. You will get bit. And you have to make a judgment call on it, because if you let the bat go, then you have 2 options. You can not do anything and cross your fingers, or you can go get post-exposure rabies. And Now, if you get bit and you haven't had your rabies, then that's a whole nother ball game. And I wouldn't recommend handling bats until you've got your
Well,
rabies.
that's what happened. I had a student who he was not supposed to be handling. And I think he thought he was being helpful because there was such a high volume.
Right.
He went and he grabbed a bag to move it, and he grabbed it the wrong way, and the bat came out of the bag and bit him.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
We let the bat go. I mean, the bat got away. He went.
They do that.
No, I know. Yeah, but that was the story.
Wait,
I mean,
how do
there's
you?
nothing wrong with that bat, you know.
Right.
Well, I know
Yeah.
what I was supposed to do, but I didn't do it. So, yeah.
Sometimes that stuff happens in the field.
Yeah.
Aiden, did you have a question?
Yeah, how do you get in? I mean, it was for the other Brooke. No offense. So
that's
how do you? I've been wondering about this. Like, how do you get involved with that lab, like with the bats? Like, because I've heard about that before. Like, I know you do another thing where like you have people like go on the beach and like spray plants and stuff. But like,
Yeah. So how do you get involved in my stuff?
Yeah.
So basically, the way it works is that you are on a listserv with Diener. And so whenever we have opportunities for either for credit stuff or for a paid opportunity, then we will create a job posting and then we send it out through there. So that's usually the way it works. And usually those emails start coming around January because that's when we have to start planning for the, for the field. A lot of times